In the heart of ancient Rome, inside a palace where marble walls glowed under torchlight, silence was enforced more brutally than law. Servants were trained to erase memory. Guards were trained not to question screams. Because behind those sealed bronze doors, power was no longer political. It was personal. History remembers Emperor Caligula as cruel, unstable, depraved. But what ancient writers recorded about his three sisters was so disturbing. Many scholars spent centuries trying to dismiss it as propaganda. They were not prisoners. They were not slaves. They were Rome's most sacred women. And yet, within the imperial palace, they were forced into rituals that blurred the line between family and possession. Tonight, we uncover testimonies hidden beneath palace floors, ceremonies Rome was forced to witness, and the trauma that echoed into the reign of Nero himself. Because what Caligula forced his sisters to endure was far worse than history ever admitted. The palace that erased memory in Rome's most powerful palace. Silence was not loyalty, it was survival. Servants were trained to forget what they saw, because memory itself was dangerous. But one night, even the walls of the imperial dining chamber could not contain what happened inside, and a young slave would witness something history would spend centuries trying to deny. The slave's name was Halitus, and in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, his existence had been reduced to function. He had been purchased young, trained thoroughly, and conditioned to understand one law above all others. Observation was death. In the emperor's private quarters, servants did not see, did not hear, and certainly did not remember. Survival depended on the disciplined erasure of reality. For 4 years, Halitus had perfected this discipline. He had served wine to senators, whose whispers could start wars. He had carried sealed scrolls containing decisions that would decide the fate of provinces. He had stood in rooms where men negotiated betrayals behind smiles. And through all of it, he had remained invisible, a moving object with no thoughts attached. Until the night the emperor invited his sisters to dine. The private triclinium was lit by low torchlight, the flames bending against polished marble walls, veined like frozen lightning. Gold cups gleamed on the low table. Perfumed smoke curled upward in slow, suffocating spirals. It was a room designed for intimacy, not ceremony, a place where the emperor entertained only those he considered extensions of himself. At the center couch reclined the ruler of Rome, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Caligula. He was only 25, yet there was something prematurely hollow in his face. Coins portrayed him youthful and divine, but in person his eyes seemed deeper set, as if sleep had abandoned him long ago. His smile came easily, but never reached those eyes. On the couches beside him lay the 3 women Rome revered as imperial princesses, his sisters. Agrippina, sharp-faced and watchful. Drusilla, luminous yet unnervingly still. Julia Livilla, the youngest, her hands trembling slightly around her cup. They wore silk fine enough to cling like mist, jewels resting on their skin like chains disguised as gifts. Their placement was deliberate, close enough for the emperor to touch without rising. And he did. At first, the gathering resembled any aristocratic dinner. Caligula spoke of philosophy, quoting Epicurus with theatrical enthusiasm. He asked his sisters questions, inviting debate as if this were an academy rather than an imperial chamber. His tone was warm, affectionate even. But Halitus noticed what others pretended not to. Drusilla's hand flinched when Caligula's fingers brushed her arm. Agrippina's jaw tightened each time his attention shifted. Julia Livilla drank too quickly, not for pleasure, but for distance. Then the emperor set down his cup. It was a small gesture, but it ended the illusion. Conversation died instantly. The air thickened. Even the torches seemed to waver. "You may go," Caligula said without looking at Halitus. The words should have brought relief. Instead, dread settled into the slave's stomach like lead. He bowed and withdrew with the other servants, the bronze doors closing behind them with a muffled finality. But before the doors sealed, he heard it. A command spoken softly, too low to distinguish words, yet carrying absolute authority. Then a sound from one of the sisters, not quite speech, not quite protest. He walked faster after that. For 3 hours he waited in the servants' quarters, staring at the wall, trying to practice the art he had mastered, forgetting before remembering could form. But the mind resists commands when fear roots deeply enough. When he returned, the chamber was silent. The emperor was gone. The 3 sisters remained. Their hair was undone, their garments disordered, the careful composure of imperial women erased. Drusilla wept without sound, tears sliding down a face emptied of expression. Agrippina did not cry. Her eyes burned with something colder, something forming behind restraint. Julia Livilla lay unconscious, her breathing shallow beneath the haze of wine and whatever else had been poured into it. Halitus cleared the plates with steady hands. Inside, he was unraveling, because in that moment he understood something every slave in the palace eventually learned. Rome was not ruled from the Senate, nor from the legions, but from rooms like this, where power answered to no law, no god, and no boundary of blood. And what he had witnessed that night was only the beginning. Blood made into ceremony Caligula did not bury his sins in shadows. He illuminated them with torches. What should have remained unspeakable inside palace walls, he transformed into public ritual. Rome's most powerful men were forced to witness what their laws forbade, and with every ceremony, the boundary between family and possession collapsed further. Power in Rome had always depended on performance. Emperors did not simply rule. They staged their authority through spectacle, ritual, and carefully engineered symbolism. Caligula understood this better than any ruler before him. But where past emperors used ceremony to reinforce order, Caligula used it to normalize the unthinkable. Within months of his sister's arrival in the palace, their presence ceased to be private. It became imperial policy. The first shift appeared subtle. Coins were minted bearing not only the emperor's likeness, but the images of Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla on the reverse. They were not depicted as sisters, but as embodiments of divine virtues, security, harmony, fortune. To the public, the message was deliberate. The emperor's bloodline itself was sacred. But symbolism soon gave way to spectacle. At state ceremonies, where Roman women traditionally appeared in the background, Caligula placed his sisters beside him, equal in elevation, equal in visibility. They stood where only wives or priestesses had ever stood. Senators noticed, priests noticed, the people noticed. No one spoke, because Caligula did more than elevate them. He sanctified them. He granted his sisters the privileges of Vestal virgins, Rome's most sacred female order. Vestals were guardians of the eternal flame, their purity considered essential to the empire's survival. Violation of a Vestal was punishable by burial alive. Yet here stood 3 women publicly honored for sacred chastity, while privately belonging to the emperor himself. The contradiction was intentional. It was a declaration that Caligula alone defined morality. Magistrates were ordered to swear annual vows, not just for the emperor's safety, but for his sisters as well. Across the empire, governors, generals, and officials repeated the oath. Soldiers added the sisters' names to their loyalty pledges. Refusal was treason. Rome was being conditioned. What began as discomfort became ritual familiarity. What felt monstrous in isolation became normalized through repetition. Caligula understood that public exposure dissolved private resistance. And then came the banquets. Formal imperial dinners were rigidly structured events, governed by centuries of protocol. Seating arrangements reflected hierarchy, gender, and propriety. Wives reclined near husbands, but never as equals. Unmarried women did not recline at all. Caligula ignored every rule. At his private banquets, he placed Drusilla beside him in the position reserved for an empress. Agrippina and Julia Livilla reclined on his other side, forming a human triad of imperial blood. Guests tried not to stare, but avoidance became impossible when the emperor began touching them, casually, possessively, while discussing philosophy, governance, or military campaigns, as if nothing were unusual. His hand resting too long on Drusilla's thigh, fingers trailing across Agrippina's wrist, gestures delivered with theatrical normalcy. No one reacted, because reaction meant death. One senator, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, made the mistake of watching too closely. His gaze lingered a moment too long during one such banquet, long enough for Caligula to notice. The arrest came the next morning. Charges of treason followed by nightfall. Evidence fabricated. Trial abbreviated. Execution swift. Rome understood the message instantly. Sight itself had become dangerous. From that moment forward, senators mastered the art of selective blindness. They laughed when required, drank when expected, and spoke of imperial virtue while witnessing its corruption unfold inches away. Caligula had achieved what no ruler before him had dared attempt. He had converted private violation into public theater. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the sisters themselves were changing. Drusilla grew paler with each appearance, her smiles mechanical, her eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. Agrippina's composure sharpened into something colder, her silence no longer submission, but calculation. Julia Livilla appeared increasingly intoxicated at public events, her laughter mistimed, her posture unsteady. Rome saw their beauty, but not their deterioration, because ceremony masked suffering as honor. And Caligula continued escalating the displays, pushing boundaries further each time, testing how much the empire would tolerate if presented as ritual rather than crime. But absolute power feeds on excess. And soon, his obsession with one sister in particular would cross from scandal into something that terrified even those who had accepted everything before it. Because Drusilla's role in his world was no longer that of sister nor symbol, but something far more dangerous. And when she died, Caligula's grief would transform Rome itself into a stage of madness. Drusilla, the sister who became a goddess among the three sisters, one was chosen above all others. Her chambers were never truly hers. A hidden passage ensured that. Rome saw her as the emperor's divine companion. But inside the palace she was fading. And when she died, Caligula did something that made even Rome fear him. Drusilla had always been the closest to Caligula, even before he became emperor. In childhood, they had shared the same tutors, the same military camps, the same early exposure to the brutal mechanics of imperial politics. But once he rose to power, that closeness transformed into something darker, something Rome sensed but dared not define. Of all his sisters, Drusilla alone was granted privileges that exceeded even imperial custom. She was not merely present beside him in ceremonies. She was positioned as his counterpart, his reflection, almost his sovereign equal. Inside the palace, her living quarters were physically connected to the emperor's through a concealed interior passage. It was designed for privacy, for convenience, but it functioned as a corridor of control. There was no lock on her side, no barrier she could enforce. Palace servants learned to recognize the pattern of footsteps in that corridor, the irregular hours, the unannounced arrivals, the duration of visits that stretched into night and returned again before dawn. No one spoke of it. Speech was unnecessary when fear communicated everything. Drusilla began to change in ways that silk and jewels could not conceal forever. Her body thinned, though imperial banquets overflowed with food. Dark crescents formed beneath her eyes. She developed a habit of pressing her fingers into her own arms, as if confirming she still inhabited her body. Servants reported that she slept rarely, and when she did, it was in brief, restless fragments. The palace physicians were summoned often, but whatever remedies they offered never altered her decline. Yet in public, Caligula elevated her further. He referred to her not as sister, but as partner in destiny. He seated her beside him in the imperial box at games. He consulted her publicly on matters of governance, whether sincerely or theatrically, no one could tell. He allowed, even encouraged rumors that their bond transcended mortal categories. Rome watched with tightening unease. Then, in the summer of 38 AD, Drusilla fell ill. At first, the illness appeared minor. A fever, the physician said. Rome was accustomed to imperial health bulletins, most exaggerated for political reassurance. But this time, Caligula's behavior signaled something far more serious. He refused to leave her bedside. State meetings were postponed. Petitions went unanswered. Messengers were turned away at the palace gates. For days he neither bathed nor slept. Servants reported hearing him speaking to her, even when she lacked strength to respond. Promises, pleas, fragments of childhood memories, spoken as if invoking a time before power had poisoned everything between them. Then, on June 10th, she died. She was 21. Rome expected mourning. What followed instead felt like collective destabilization. Caligula did not grieve privately. He weaponized grief. He declared a statewide mourning period, in which laughter itself was forbidden. Informers were deployed to report violations. Citizens overheard expressing amusement, even in unrelated contexts, were arrested. Some were executed. Weddings were postponed. Festivals canceled. The empire entered emotional lockdown. But the most shocking decree came days later. Caligula ordered the Senate to deify Drusilla. No Roman woman had ever been granted official state divinity. Deification was reserved for emperors, and even then, usually posthumous political gestures. Yet Caligula demanded immediate canonization. Temples were commissioned. Priests appointed. Statues erected depicting Drusilla as a living goddess reborn in divine form. She was given the title Panthea, the All-Goddess. Rome obeyed, because Rome had no choice. Offerings were made in her name. Oaths sworn to her spirit. Her image placed among Rome's sacred figures. The emperor who had claimed her in life now immortalized her in death, transforming personal obsession into national worship. But grief did not soften him. It unhinged him. Witnesses described him wandering palace corridors at night, calling her name, insisting she answered. He claimed to see her shadow in torchlight, to hear her voice behind curtains. His temper grew volatile, his punishments more arbitrary, his spectacles more grotesque. Because Drusilla had not merely been a sister, she had been the emotional axis of his power. And with her gone, something inside the emperor fractured beyond repair. Rome had feared his excess before. Now it feared his instability, because if he could turn a sister into a goddess, there was no boundary left he would not cross next. Agrippina, the sister who refused to break, while one sister shattered, another endured in silence. She did not cry, nor collapse. She watched. Inside her, humiliation was transforming into calculation, and the empire had no idea it was witnessing the birth of a future power more dangerous than Caligula himself. If Drusilla had been the emperor's emotional fixation, Agrippina was something far more complicated, a survivor shaped by the same childhood trauma that had twisted her brother, but hardened rather than broken by it. From an early age, she had learned that imperial life offered only two paths: submission that erased you, or endurance that weaponized memory. By the time Caligula became emperor, Agrippina was already a mother. She had been married young, strategically placed within Rome's aristocratic alliances, and had given birth to a son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy history would later know as Nero. Motherhood had given her something Caligula could not control completely: a future investment, a living extension of her bloodline beyond her brother's reach. Yet even that did not shield her. When Caligula summoned his sisters into the palace, their marriages became ceremonial fictions. Husbands were tolerated at a distance, permitted occasional appearances to maintain political optics, but stripped of authority. The sisters' true residence and true loyalty now belonged to the emperor. Agrippina adapted quickly. Where Drusilla retreated inward and Julia Livilla escaped through intoxication, Agrippina sharpened her awareness. Palace servants noticed it first, the way her eyes tracked movement, memorized conversations, studied reactions. She did not resist openly. Resistance would have meant execution. Instead, she mastered imperial theater, performing obedience while storing every humiliation like ammunition. During private summons, she complied outwardly, but never surrendered psychologically. Servants later recorded that her face would become unnaturally still, her gaze distant not from dissociation, but from calculation, as though she were observing her own degradation from a strategic distance. She was learning power from the inside. Agrippina understood something her sisters did not. Caligula's authority, though absolute, depended on perception, on fear carefully maintained, on loyalty constantly reinforced. And fear could fracture. Loyalty could shift. Absolute rulers, history proved, often fell not from external invasion, but internal betrayal. So she watched for fractures. She observed how senators flattered him publicly, but trembled privately. She noted which guards were loyal from devotion, and which from obligation. She memorized the names of officers who had served her father Germanicus, men who still revered her bloodline even while serving her brother. Hatred, in Agrippina, did not burn hot. It condensed. After Drusilla's death, the palace atmosphere shifted dramatically. Caligula's instability intensified, and with instability came vulnerability. His grief made him erratic. His punishments grew disproportionate. Executions increased. Confiscations multiplied. Rome's elite began fearing not scandal, but survival. Agrippina recognized the change instantly. Where others saw danger, she saw opportunity forming slowly beneath chaos. She began cultivating quiet alliances, conversations framed as shared concern for the empire, veiled discussions about stability, whispers about succession. She never spoke treason directly. She did not need to. In imperial courts, implication was more powerful than declaration. But Caligula was not blind. Paranoia was his native instinct, honed since childhood purges had taught him that family itself could become a threat. Informers fed him fragments. Agrippina speaking too long with certain senators, exchanging letters more frequently than protocol required, maintaining contact with military households loyal to Germanicus' legacy. Suspicion took root. The emperor, who had once paraded his sisters as symbols of unity, began viewing them as potential conspirators. Surveillance tightened. Servants were reassigned. Conversations monitored. Invitations restricted. Agrippina felt the net closing, but by then her transformation was complete. She was no longer merely surviving the palace. She was preparing to outlive it. Because unlike Drusilla, whose suffering ended in death, Agrippina intended to convert hers into dynastic revenge. And that revenge would not strike immediately. It would wait. It would grow through her son. It would one day place Nero on Rome's throne, a ruler whose cruelty would carry echoes of everything his mother had endured inside Caligula's palace. But before that future could unfold, another sister would attempt escape in a far more desperate way, and her fate would prove that leaving Caligula's shadow was far more dangerous than remaining inside it. Julia Livilla. Escape through oblivion. Not all prisoners fight. Some disappear inside themselves. The youngest sister chose numbness over resistance. Wine became her shield, silence her refuge. But when she finally tried to escape Caligula's reach, exile became her death sentence. Julia Livilla had been the youngest when tragedy first carved through their family. She was still a child when their father died, still impressionable when their mother was exiled, still forming her understanding of power when her brother ascended the throne. Unlike Agrippina, she had not developed political instincts. Unlike Drusilla, she had not become emotionally bound to Caligula. She existed somewhere between fear and disbelief, too young to strategize, too aware to remain untouched. When she was summoned into the imperial palace, the transition shattered what remained of her innocence. Servants assigned to her quarters observed the change almost immediately. At first, it manifested as restlessness, pacing at night, requesting musicians at unusual hours, demanding perfume strong enough to suffocate the air. But soon another habit emerged: drinking. Wine was common in Roman households, but Julia Livilla's consumption exceeded custom. She drank upon waking, before meals, after ceremonies, before sleep. Soon the wine was no longer plain. Palace attendants were ordered to mix it with calming extracts, poppy infusions, herbal sedatives, substances known to dull the mind and soften memory. The effect was immediate. She began moving through the palace as if submerged underwater, her laughter delayed, her speech blurred, her eyes unfocused. At banquets, she reclined beside her brother, already intoxicated, her awareness muffled before the evening even began. Caligula appeared entertained by it. He mocked her indulgence publicly, calling her the sister who prefers dreams to reality, prompting forced laughter from guests who understood mockery was safer than silence. But intoxication was not indulgence. It was anesthesia. Servants reported that when sober moments broke through rare, jagged intervals, Julia Livilla would tremble uncontrollably. She avoided mirrors. She startled at footsteps. She clutched blankets even in warm chambers, as if shielding herself from unseen cold. Sleep did not bring peace either. She cried out during the night, fragmented words escaping through narcotic haze. Where Drusilla dissolved into fragility and Agrippina hardened into calculation, Julia Livilla disintegrated slowly. Yet numbness could not last forever. After Drusilla's death and Caligula's descent into instability, palace tensions intensified. Executions became common. Surveillance expanded. Fear no longer lingered in corners. It occupied every corridor. And within that tightening environment, whispers of conspiracy began circulating among Rome's elite. Julia Livilla heard them. At first, she ignored the murmurs, retreating deeper into intoxication. But desperation has a way of cutting through sedation. Gradually, she began meeting privately with individuals already under suspicion: senators, exiled loyalists, distant relatives of disgraced families. Whether she sought protection, escape, or revenge remains debated by historians. But one truth is certain: she spoke too openly, to the wrong ears. Imperial informers thrived in Caligula's court. Conversations were currency, betrayal a survival tactic. Reports reached the emperor describing Julia Livilla's associations, her alleged support for plots seeking to destabilize him. Whether the conspiracy was real or exaggerated hardly mattered. Suspicion alone was sufficient. Caligula's response was swift and calculated. Rather than execute her publicly, which might provoke sympathy, he chose exile, a punishment designed to erase rather than murder. Julia Livilla was arrested without ceremony, stripped of imperial privileges, and transported under guard to a barren island in the Mediterranean. No court, no defense, no farewell. Exile in Rome was not relocation. It was slow execution. The island lacked comfort, society, or adequate provisions. Prisoners depended on imperial mercy for supplies, and mercy was not something Caligula extended to perceived traitors, even those of his own blood. Records suggest her rations diminished steadily. Communication ceased. Visitors were forbidden. Wine, the substance that had once insulated her mind, was absent. For the first time in years, Julia Livilla faced reality without sedation. Alone, isolated, stripped of distraction. Ancient accounts describe her health deteriorating rapidly. Malnutrition, exposure, and psychological collapse converged. She died there. At just 24, No imperial mourning followed. No divine honors. No public acknowledgement. Her existence was quietly erased from official narratives, as if exile had not only removed her body from Rome, but her memory as well. Yet her fate sent a silent message through the imperial court. If the emperor could discard his youngest sister without hesitation, then no one, not senator, not general, not even family, was beyond disposal. And as fear deepened across Rome, plots against Caligula began shifting from whispers into action. The assassination. When the palace finally struck back, tyrants rarely fall from enemies outside. They fall from shadows within. The palace that protected Caligula had become a prison of silent hatred. Guards who once swore loyalty now sharpened betrayal in secret. And when the emperor finally fell, Rome uncovered horrors it could never bury again. By the 4th year of Caligula's reign, fear had matured into exhaustion. Rome had endured unpredictable executions, public humiliations of senators, confiscation of wealth, and spectacles that blurred the line between governance and madness. But inside the imperial palace, resentment had grown more personal, more intimate, because those closest to the emperor witnessed what the wider empire only suspected. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor's life, had become unwilling witnesses to his volatility. They escorted senators to executions ordered on whims. They enforced mourning decrees so extreme that citizens were punished for laughter. They guarded corridors where imperial violations unfolded behind locked doors. Loyalty, when stretched too far, transforms into quiet rebellion. Among the officers was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran tribune long respected within the guard. Caligula despised him, mocking his voice, humiliating him publicly, assigning him degrading watchwords meant to emasculate rather than command. In Rome's martial culture, honor was oxygen. Caligula suffocated it deliberately. But humiliation alone does not create assassination. It was the convergence of personal insult, political fear, and imperial instability that forged the conspiracy. Senators, officers, and palace insiders began exchanging coded assurances, brief, cautious, deniable. They did not speak of justice. They spoke of survival. If Caligula remained unchecked, Rome itself would fracture beneath his excess. The plan formed within the very corridors he believed safest. On January 24th, 41 A.D., the emperor attended public games held near the Palatine complex. The event was routine: theater performances, athletic displays, imperial appearances designed to reinforce his visibility. Security was present, but relaxed. After all, danger was expected from the masses, not from the guards surrounding him. As Caligula moved through an underground passage beneath the arena, a private corridor used to transition between venues the conspirators acted. Cassius Chaerea approached first, requesting the day's watchword. It was a ritual exchange, one repeated countless times. But instead of receiving a response, Chaerea drew his blade. The first strike landed beneath the emperor's ribs. Caligula staggered, stunned more by betrayal than pain. Witnesses later recorded that he attempted to speak. Whether command, curse, or plea remains unknown, but the corridor erupted before words could form. Multiple guards joined the assault, blades rising and falling in rapid succession. The emperor collapsed onto the stone floor he had walked moments earlier in absolute authority. Within seconds, Rome's most feared man was unrecognizable beneath blood and wounds. But the conspirators did not stop with him. Understanding that dynasties perpetuate vengeance, they moved swiftly through the palace, assassinating his wife Caesonia and their infant daughter, extinguishing immediate succession. It was not merely assassination. It was eradication. News spread through Rome with violent speed. Citizens hesitated between relief and terror, unsure whether celebration would invite retaliation. Senators convened in emergency session, debating whether to restore the republic entirely. But before decisions solidified, something unexpected began surfacing. With Caligula dead, palace restrictions loosened. Sealed chambers were opened. Administrative archives were reviewed. Servants, once silenced by fear, began speaking cautiously. Testimonies recorded not as political accusations, but as household documentation long buried. Accounts emerged describing private ceremonies, coercive rituals, psychological torment inflicted within imperial quarters. Writings hidden by servants, fragments of observation preserved secretly beneath floors and behind walls, corroborated what ancient historians had only hinted: the suffering of his sisters, the normalization of taboo, the conversion of personal violation into state ritual. Rome realized the extent of what had occurred not through rumor, but through evidence. Yet even in death, Caligula's shadow endured. Agrippina survived, carrying within her the memory of everything she had witnessed. Years later, she would maneuver her son, Nero, onto the imperial throne. And Nero's reign, marked by cruelty and spectacle, would echo psychological patterns born inside Caligula's palace. Trauma had not ended with assassination. It had evolved. Because power, when fused with unchecked desire, does not vanish with one ruler's death. It lingers in bloodlines, institutions, and learned behaviors, passed silently through generations. The palace on the Palatine Hill remained standing long after Caligula's body was removed. Its marble halls still gleamed. Its corridors still echoed with imperial footsteps. But beneath its foundations lay memories Rome could never fully erase. Memories of sisters turned into symbols, of rituals born from obsession, of a ruler who believed divinity placed him beyond morality. And history, despite centuries of attempted sanitization, never completely forgot.